The top baits for fall bass fishing. Let's get into it. I like to throw a spinnerbait as my #1 choice. Why? Because the bass are up roaming around chasing bait fish like shad and bluegill, and those bait fish are moving. They're on the move constantly, and the bass are right behind them. So it can be difficult to find them. So you need a surge bait, and a spinnerbait is my #1 go-to bait. You can cover an awful lot of water. It gives up a great bait fish profile, so those bass are going to hone in on and crush it. The other thing about spinnerbaits is that you can fish it really shallow in just a couple feet of water, and you can get it down as deep as you want. You fish the entire water column, regardless of, you don't have to change up baits or anything like that for the most part. You do have to change up a little bit if you want to vary your retrieve speed, and we'll talk about that in just a second. But typically I like to start off with a 3/4 ounce double Indiana blade white spinnerbait. That is like my go-to bait year-round, and it works really well in the fall because, again, white, got that shad kind of color to it, and you can, again, fish it at all depths. Cool thing about it is you can bring it back really fast, and that's kind of a key in the fall, is a fast retrieve. You don't want that bait to lay over sideways, and they'll do that with lighter baits. So a 3/4 ounce with the double Indiana, it remain upright, and you can bring it back really fast just under the surface, and you can get some vicious strikes that way. Now, if you need to slow it down and get it down a little bit deeper, a double willow leaf blade works really well. And you got 3/8 ounce. And I'll use that to get that down a little bit deeper off of, tapering points, drop-offs, bluffs, areas that are near flats or near shallow water, but the bass are hanging up off of it. That's when I'll use a double willow leaf blade combination with a little bit lighter lure. And that enables me to get it down deeper and to bring it back nice and slow to get those strikes. Rod and reel combination, this is really simple. A 7'1" medium heavy fast action rod spooled with 15-pound fluorocarbon line. I like to use Seaguard and Vizex line for this, and using a 6'5" to 7'1" gear ratio reel. That'll do it for you. Make it really simple. It doesn't matter, again, you can swap out the spinnerbait size and you don't have to change any of the rest of it. So that's #1 key for fishing spinnerbaits in the fall. Next bait that works really well in the fall, the vibrating crankbait, like rattle traps and the Booyah one knockers. These things work fantastic. Why? Well, they're baitfish shaped, and they look and sound like baitfish, and guess what? That's exactly what the bass are keying on right now, so they work really well. Key thing about fishing them is where you fish them and how you fish them. So what I like to do, first of all, is fish these out and around at the outside edges of weeds and along docks and long tapering points and bluffs. The way to fish them, one way is to bring them back at a steady retrieve, and you can catch a lot of fish that way. It does really work. But if you're not getting a lot of bites with that, then speed up, get it up towards the surface, and just bring it back really quick and see if you can elicit any bites that way. A lot of times doing that across the tops of like milfoil, a hydrilla that's submerged, and you can bring it across the top of that, just tick the top of those weeds, and sometimes you'll snag a little bit and you just give it a little pop to rip it out, and that little change in cadence and that little pop with the rod sometimes all it takes to trigger a bite. So that can work really well as well. Now when you're fishing on the weed edge, again, I fish that fast, but then on subsequent casts I may slow down and get mid-column and bring it back at a little bit slower pace. And if that's not getting any strikes, another way to fish it is to let it flutter down and hit the bottom, and then jig it up off the bottom and reel up the slack and let it fall back down to the bottom. Let it sit for a second and then pull it back up and plop back down. What you're doing is the bait's fluttering up and then fluttering back down, fluttering up and fluttering back down. And a lot of shad, they start dying off in the fall, and they're given this type of activity, falling and fluttering as they fall, and that can trigger a lot of strikes. So rattle traps, Booyah one knockers, they work really well. As far as rod and reel, again, I'll throw a 7.3 to 7.5 medium heavy fast action rod. I may even go a medium power rod because of the treble hooks, just something a little bit lighter on it. Again, 15-pound, 12-pound fluorocarbon line works best. I'll use a snap on the end of it to give that so the bait has enough movement. I won't tie directly to the bait, but a snap, not a swivel, just a snap. And that typically is all I need. The reel, a 6.5 to 7:1 gear ratio reel, works really well for this type of technique and bait. Next bait I like to throw in the fall, Buzzbaits. So a lot of folks throw away, they take their Buzzbaits in the top waters and put them in the tackle box after summer and don't throw them again. That's a mistake. Again, a lot of fish they're all up shallow, right? The bait fish are up shallow, the bass are up there with them, and there's just a lot of activity, and top waters can do really well, especially Buzzbaits. Going back to what I said before, the bass are roaming around because they're chasing all this bait fish, so it's difficult to kind of find them sometimes. A buzzbait, you can cover a lot of water and very quickly and effectively. So buzzbait is a really good lure to use in the fall. Now, one of the things that folks do sometimes is they'll take the skirt off and put like a frog trailer on there, or maybe a paddle tail trailer. That gives a little more buoyancy and gives a bigger target for the bass to hone in on, so you have fewer missed strikes. Plus, you can slow it down a bit more. And a buzzbait, when you're moving at a very slow pace, best you can, tends to get more strikes. So try that little trick. Throw it around the outside of weed edges, throw it in between the pockets of lily pads, along docks, floating docks and pier docks. Drop off points, long tapering points are some of my favorite to go. Both secondary and main lake points during the fall can be very productive. You know, there's really no wrong place to throw a buzzbait during this time of year. Just make sure that you've got the proper equipment. And what I mean by that is you want to use braided line, 30 to 50 pound braided line, tie it straight onto the lure, no snaps or swivels or anything like that. I use Uniknot. You can use a polymer as well. That works just as well if you're comfortable throwing tying the polymer knot. And I use a medium heavy, fast action, 7.2 to 7.6 rod, teamed up with a 6.3 to 7.1 gear ratio reel. And that works really well for a buzzbait. Now the next lure, right along the same line of topwaters, is a frog. Frogs, some people don't think about frogs during the fall, but some people don't know this. Frogs actually migrate to the shallows and they hibernate during the winter. And the bass know this, and they chase them up, and they're actually feeding on frogs in addition to bait fish. So a frog can be a very popular way of catching fish. Now, all you do is throw out there and let it sit, and give it a few pop, 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 and let it sit. And just as long as you can stand it. Sometimes it's just not moving at all, and that's when a bass will strike it. So try giving it long pauses and then shorten up the pauses in between pops, and sometimes popping it all the way back to the back to the boat. A quick cadence like that sometimes is what it takes to trigger. You just kind of have to experiment with it, because each day they want something a little bit different. Again, throw it in between pockets of weeds. It's kind of the open areas. Because these are weedless, they work really well when you're going across the tops of milfoil or hydrilla pads, weeds that have matted over. You can bring it across the top of that, bring it to an opening and pause it in the opening of those matted vegetation, and sometimes get walloped when you do that. Or when you get to the edge of that mat, hold on tight, because the bass sometimes will follow it all the way out to the edge, and as soon as it pops free, boom, a bass will blast it. Scare the bejeebies out of you sometimes, but it's a fun way of fishing. And because of this, you want stout equipment. So we're doing a 7.4 to 7.6 medium heavy action rod with 50 pound braid tied directly onto the bait. No snaps, no swivels here. And the reel, I like to use a 7.1 to gear ratio reel. It's a little bit faster, but sometimes you need that, especially if a bass grabs it and pulls it down where there's weeds. You want to get his head turned and get that fish moving to you as fast as you can. Don't give him that chance to bury up in the weeds or wrap you up in lily pads or anything like that. So a faster gear ratio can help you wrench them free from all that and get them to you. But that is an exciting and fun way to catch fish, is with frogs. Now, I'd be remiss if I'm talking about fall fishing and not talk about crankbaits. Now, there's a plethora of crankbaits to choose from, so I'm going to break it down to three main ones that I like to use during the fall. The first one is the square bell. The square bell, the cool thing about that is you can use it very similar to the vibrating crankbaits that I just mentioned, where you can get it into the weeds like hydrilla and milfoil. Just go across the tops and then let it just tick the top of that and rip it out. The difference here is with this bait is when you rip it out, you can give it a pause, because a lot of them are buoyant, or even oftentimes they just kind of hover right there. They're suspending kind of square bill baits, which work really well for this type of techniques. Let it hit that, or maybe bring it along a docks, or you're fishing some riprap, bang it off of that, and then let it sit. Give it a pause, and it'll just sit there in place, suspending, and oftentimes that'll trigger a strike before you, or after letting it sit, then when you start to crank and move it again, wham, they'll hit it when it starts to move again. So be ready for that kind of strike. But that's kind of the fun way to fish square bills. They work really well for that type of thing. And because they deflect off the cover and whatnot, they don't get hung up as easy. So that's a good bait to use when you're fishing shallow. Another bait to use, though, is a medium diving crankbait. And I use that on the outside of weed edges. Could be milfoil, could be lily pads, hydrilla, coontail, whatever it may be, but on the outside edges where it's not too deep, say 10 feet deep at the most, a medium diving crankbait can get you down along there. Crank it down and just bring it back at a regular cadence. Usually elicits a lot of bites, but if you're not getting bit that way, put some pauses into it and get some erratic movements. You know, just pop it with your rod or stop and go retrieve with your reel. You know, anything you can do to give it a little bit of erratic behavior oftentimes will trigger strikes. If you can get it to tick off the weeds without getting hung up, you can always try that too. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Kind of depends on the design of the crankbait, but that can be a good way of triggering bites too. And then the last type of crankbait is a deep diving crankbait. You know, these go down deeper than 10 feet deep. This is for fishing not only the weed lines, just deeper weed lines like I just mentioned before, but deeper structure, like drop-offs and points and humps, ridges, or some brush piles that are in deeper water. That type of thing works really well they're best suited for deeper diving crankbaits. And crankbaits, man, again, this fish are feeding on bait fish. So crankbaits, I mean, fall is crankbait time. It really is. I mean, crankbaits shine, year-round crankbaits work, but fall is arguably the best time for crankbaits. Just because that's what bass are keying on. So make sure you've got at least those 3 types of crankbaits with you. For the rods, you want a cranking rod, right? So 7.4 to 7.8, medium power, fast action rod, or a medium heavy rod, moderate action rod. Something that's got a lot of flex, give, that parabolic action to it. That's what you want. It helps cast it out far. Plus, because they have those little treble hooks on them with a small bite and a thin wire hooks, that give, that rod enables you to keep that fish pinned rather than ripping the hooks out of his mouth that a stouter rod would do. Pair that with 12-pound fluorocarbon line. I like to use fluorocarbon because, again, it's got some stretch to it. If you got braid to it, you have 2 problems, well, 3 actually. Braid, first of all, doesn't have that stretch, so you put all the pressure on the hooks. That can rip the hooks out of the fish's mouth or straighten the hooks out, or the fish can use that as leverage to pull free. So you want some give in your line. Braid doesn't have it, number one. Number two, braid has some buoyancy to it, so you can't get that crankbait down to the full running depth. The braid won't allow you to do that. And number 3, a lot of times when you're using braid with crankbaits, the braid will get tangled in the hooks during the cast and foul it up and kind of ruin that whole cast and presentation. So fluorocarbon solves all that. I don't use leaders at all with this for all the reasons above. Just braid and crankbaits don't go well together in my opinion, so I just use straight up fluorocarbon. I tie it to a snap, and the snap connects to the crankbait. That allows the crankbait freedom of movement. You can use a loop knot too if you feel really good with that, but I feel that also is a weaker knot, so that's why I use a snap. And as far as the reel is concerned, I'll use a 6.3 to 6.5 gear ratio. If I can get away with it and get a slower gear ratio reel, I will. It's hard to find those that are in the 5 to whatever range, 5 to 1, 5, 6. They're few and far between, but if you can get one of those, that's even better. A slower retrieve works really well with these, and stop and go type of retrieve works really well with these kind of baits. So that is definitely something I would have in my arsenal and where and when I'd fish those crankbaits. And then finally, the last bait, and we'll be talking about a lot of fast moving baits right now, but let's shift gears and go to the jig. It's a good old standby. Gotta have it already to throw pretty much year round, and fall is no different. Jig works really well. Now here's how you piece it together, guys. A jig, you know, it's a slow vertical fall, and you can crawl it on the bottom for those bass that are more reluctant to bite. This is what you do when you've used these faster moving baits to find the fish, where they're schooling, where they're more really active. and you pick off fish using your faster moving baits, go back through that area again with a jig. I can't tell you how many times I've picked off more fish, and often bigger fish, with a jig after I've located where the fish are at. A lot of times those bigger fish just won't trigger off some of those faster moving baits, but a jig, I'll put a larger craw on the end of it, or maybe a space monkey, or a beaver style bait, something that's got some bulk to it to slow down the fall, make it fall a little bit slower, and that oftentimes triggers more bites. A larger profile gives them something to hone in on as well, especially if the water's a little dingy. But that's what I'll throw as a follow-up bait. After I've worked an area with fast moving baits, I'll come back through with a jig and let it, a lot of times falling, they'll hit it on the fall, but sometimes you just crawl it on the bottom or hop it up and down on the bottom. Works really well, especially on those outside weed lines when those bass are roaming, hunting for prey. A jig can be really productive. So those are the baits that I use during the winter time, during the fall. I'm thinking about winter already, it's getting there. But during the fall, and armed with those, you can go out and catch yourself a whole bunch of bass. Hope that works for you. For more tips and tricks like this, visit bassresource.com.